There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the simple weight of a head resting on your shoulder. You don't recognize them as tectonic plates shifting deep beneath the surface of your world. You only feel the faint tremor, a subtle vibration that you might dismiss as nothing, a trick of the light. But later, when you look back from the landscape that has been irrevocably altered, you can trace every crack and fissure back to that single, silent, ordinary moment. For me, that moment smelled faintly of the rain on Julian's jacket and the Earl Grey tea going cold on the coffee table, and it sounded like the steady, trusting rhythm of his breathing as he slept against me, utterly unaware that he was rebuilding me and breaking me all at once. It was a Tuesday, and everything was about to change. He had collapsed onto my sofa an hour earlier, a ship surrendering to the tide. He'd brought with him the frantic energy of a week spent untangling some catastrophic error in a client's code, a digital ghost he'd been chasing through thousands of lines of logic. He spoke in clipped, exhausted sentences about servers and firewalls and the particular idiocy of a man named Philip, his words a thin veneer over a weariness that was bone deep. I had just listened, making him tea he barely touched, letting the space in my small apartment absorb his static charge. I was the ground wire to his lightning. It was a role I had played for him for years, a silent contract established somewhere in the long, rambling decade of our friendship. I was the quiet room he came to when the world outside was too loud. And I, in turn, had built my own quiet world around the space he occupied within it. We had put on a documentary about deep-sea life, something with a hushed, calming narrator and the slow, balletic dance of creatures from the abyss. Julian's commentary, usually sharp and witty, faded after the first 10 minutes. His sentences grew softer, then fragmented, until all that was left was the sound of the television and the rain beginning to tap against the window panes. I felt the gradual shift of his weight as he listed toward me, a slow, inevitable lean. It was a familiar gravitational pull, one I had learned to brace myself for, to accept without comment. But this time was different. He didn't stop at the polite boundary of the cushion between us. He kept sinking, his shoulder pressing against mine, until finally, with a soft, unconscious sigh, his head came to rest in the space between my shoulder and my neck. And there he stayed. He was asleep. My entire body went still, every muscle locking into place. I became a statue, a piece of furniture, my only purpose to be the solid object upon which he could rest. I could feel the warmth of him seeping through my sweater, a localized heat that seemed to radiate through my entire nervous system. I could count each individual breath by the gentle rise and fall of his chest against my arm. The television droned on, showing images of bioluminescent fish drifting through an eternal night, and I felt like one of them, suspended in a dark, silent, and profound new world. My world had shrunk to the few square inches where he was touching me. This was the precipice. For years, I had lived on a carefully maintained plateau of friendship, terrified of the sheer drop into the canyon of what I truly felt for him. And now, in his sleep, he had simply walked over to the edge and invited me to look down. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, and I told it to be quiet, to be still, lest it wake the man who held its every beat in his unknowing hands. The story of Julian and me began, as so many do, in a place of benign institutional beige. It was a university lecture hall, cavernous and smelling of floor wax and stale coffee, filled with the nervous energy of 200 freshmen pretending to be adults. The course was Introduction to Renaissance Art, a mandatory humanities credit that neither of us, a future software engineer and a budding photographer, had any particular passion for. I had chosen a seat halfway up the tiered rows, a strategic position that offered a clear view of the projection screen without being close enough to risk being called upon by the professor. I was arranging my notebooks, creating a small, orderly fortress around myself, when he slid into the seat beside me. He was a whirlwind of controlled chaos, all limbs and apologies as his backpack knocked against the armrest. He smelled of clean laundry and the outdoors, and his smile, when he turned it on me, was like a sudden burst of sunlight in the artificially lit room. It was disarming, genuine, and it made a complete wreck of the careful perimeter I had established around myself. "Sorry," he'd said, his voice a low, warm rumble. "Am I crowding you?" I remember just shaking my head, unable to form a coherent word. He was beautiful in the way that makes you momentarily forget how to breathe, a casual, unstudied kind of handsome that seemed entirely unaware of its own power. His hair was a dark, unruly mess, and his eyes were a startling shade of green, flecked with gold, like sunlight through leaves. He settled in, pulling out a laptop that was covered in stickers for bands I'd never heard of and obscure coding languages. He was an open book, while I felt like a text written in a dead language. For the entire 90-minute lecture on Giotto's use of fresco, I was more aware of the inches of air separating my arm from his than I was of the birth of Western perspective. I could feel the heat radiating from him, a constant, low-grade hum of energy that my own quiet, observant nature was irresistibly drawn to. He was a star, and I, a satellite, was already being pulled into his orbit. Our friendship was forged in the crucible of late-night study sessions fueled by terrible vending machine coffee and shared packets of instant noodles. We were an unlikely pair. Julian saw the world as a series of logical problems to be solved, systems to be understood and optimized. He found a clean, mathematical beauty in the architecture of a well-written program. I, on the other hand, saw the world as a collection of moments to be captured, compositions of light and shadow that revealed some unspoken truth. I was looking for the ghost in the machine. He was building the machine. Yet, somehow, our perspectives complemented each other. He would explain the complex algorithms behind digital image processing to me, and I would try to explain why the way the late afternoon sun hit a dusty windowsill could break your heart. He grounded my artistic abstractions in logic, and I think, offered him a glimpse into the messy, illogical, and beautiful chaos of the human heart that his lines of code could never quite replicate. The moment I knew I was in love with him wasn't a dramatic, cinematic revelation. It was quiet, mundane, and utterly devastating. It was sophomore year, during finals week. We had been camped out in a remote corner of the library for what felt like days, surrounded by a barricade of textbooks and empty coffee cups. It was nearly 3 in the morning, and the library was a ghost town. Julian had fallen asleep, his head pillowed on a thick computer science textbook, his face illuminated by the pale, clinical glow of his laptop screen. His features were softened in sleep, the usual restless energy stilled, leaving behind a vulnerability that was almost painful to witness. A strand of dark hair had fallen across his forehead, and without thinking, with an instinct that came from a place deeper than conscious thought, I reached out and gently brushed it away. My fingers grazed his skin, just for a second. It was like touching a live wire. A jolt went through me, a profound and terrifying shock of recognition. It was a feeling so immense, so absolute, that it felt like a physical organ in my chest had just sprung into existence, heavy and aching and full. In the sterile silence of that library, under the hum of the fluorescent lights, I realized that my world had reoriented itself. Julian was its new magnetic north, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that I could never, ever tell him. To do so would be to risk shattering the most important friendship I had ever known. So I packed that feeling away, locked it in a darkroom deep inside myself, an undeveloped image that I was too afraid to expose to the light. Over the years, our lives diverged and intertwined like two vines growing up the same wall. He graduated and was immediately snapped up by a prestigious tech firm, his brilliance and easy confidence making him a natural fit for the corporate world. I scraped by, taking on freelance photography gigs, shooting weddings, portraits, product catalogs, anything to pay the bills while I worked on my own art in the stolen hours of the night. He dated a series of bright, lovely women who were all, in their own ways, perfect for him. I watched from the sidelines, playing the role of the supportive best friend, the one he came to for advice, the one who helped him pick out birthday presents and listened to him dissect the minutiae of his relationships. I became an expert in a particular kind of emotional alchemy, learning to transform the sharp, jagged rocks of my jealousy into the smooth, polished stones of platonic affection. It was a constant, exhausting performance. Each time he introduced me to a new girlfriend, I would feel that latent image in my internal darkroom stir, threatening to develop, and I would have to plunge it back into the chemical stop bath of self-preservation. His longest relationship was with Chloe. She was a landscape architect, smart and kind and beautiful, and for 5 years, they built a life together. I liked her genuinely. It was impossible not to. She understood his drive, and she seemed to genuinely appreciate our friendship. She never treated me like a threat, because in her mind, there was no threat to perceive. I was Leo, Julian's best friend, a fixed and harmless point in their shared universe. During those 5 years, I perfected my role. I became a master of the benign. I learned how to calibrate my smiles, how to measure out my affection for him in safe, friendly doses. I built a fortress of plausible deniability around my heart, brick by careful brick. But sometimes, when I was alone in my darkroom, watching an image of a stranger's face slowly emerge in the developing tray, I would let myself feel the full weight of it. The profound, cavernous loneliness of loving someone who saw you as nothing more than a brother, a confidant, a safe harbor. A harbor is a place ships leave from. It is not their destination. The end of Julian and Chloe's relationship was not a sudden shipwreck, but a slow, grinding dissolution. From my vantage point, it seemed to be a death by 1,000 small compromises, a gradual erosion of connection that left them standing on opposite sides of a chasm they no longer knew how to cross. Julian, a man who built his life on logic and predictable outcomes, was completely lost. The system had failed. The code was broken, and he didn't have the documentation to debug it. He never spoke about the breakup in terms of emotional devastation, but in terms of system failure. "It doesn't compute," he would say, staring into the bottom of a glass of whiskey. The inputs were all correct. The expected output was a shared future. But we got a null value. It just terminated. He was trying to apply logic to the illogical, to find a rational explanation for the messy, unpredictable heartbreak that had torn his well-ordered world apart. That was when the shift began. It was subtle at first. He started showing up at my apartment more often, usually late at night, with a flimsy pretext of being in the neighborhood or needing to borrow a book he had no intention of reading. He wasn't looking for conversation, not really. He was looking for presence. He would sit on my couch, sometimes talking, sometimes just staring at the television, but what he was really doing was absorbing the quiet. My apartment, a place I had always considered my solitary sanctuary, became his. He was like a man coming in from a blizzard, slowly thawing by the fire, shedding the ice and frost of his collapsed life. He brought with him an aura of profound loneliness, a silence that was different from my own contented quiet. His was a hollow, echoing silence. Mine was a full one. And slowly, my silence began to fill his. He talked about Chloe, but only in frustratingly abstract terms. He would analyze their arguments as if they were flawed lines of code, pointing out logical fallacies and inefficient communication protocols. He never once said, "I miss her," or "I'm heartbroken." Instead, he would say things like, "Our conflict resolution algorithm was fundamentally broken," or "There was a fatal exception in our long-term planning module." It was his armor, his way of intellectualizing a pain that was too raw to touch directly. I would listen, letting him process in the only way he knew how, offering no solutions, only a space for him to lay out the broken pieces of his logic. I knew he wasn't really talking about code. He was talking about the gaping hole in his life, the sudden, terrifying absence of the person who had been his home base for 5 years. He was adrift, and he had paddled his lifeboat to the only shore he knew. Mine. The first time he fell asleep on the couch, it felt like an accident. A simple consequence of emotional and physical exhaustion. I had let him sleep for a couple of hours, then gently woken him up and sent him home in a taxi. The second time, a week later, It felt less like an accident and more like a test. He'd shown up with takeout and a bottle of wine, and we'd settled in for a movie. Halfway through, his eyes had drifted shut, and his head had slumped onto a throw pillow. I watched him for a long time, the flickering light from the screen playing across his face. A war raged inside me. The friend in me wanted to wake him, to tell him to go home to his own bed. But the other part of me, the part one kept locked away, was desperate to let him stay. It was a selfish, dangerous desire, just to have him here, in my space, breathing my air. In the end, I did nothing. I let him sleep. I turned off the television, draped a blanket over him, and went to my own bed, where I lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of him breathing in the next room. It was the loneliest and most comforting sound in the world. That night marked the beginning of the ritual. It became an unspoken, regular occurrence. 2 or 3 nights a week, Julian would end up at my apartment. The pretexts grew thinner and eventually disappeared altogether. He would just text, coming over, and I would know that my couch was reserved for the night. We developed a silent choreography. He would arrive, shed the armor of his day, and we would settle into our respective ends of the sofa. We would talk, or watch something, or just sit in comfortable silence, until the inevitable pull of sleep took him under. I would wait until his breathing evened out. Then I would cover him with the thick wool blanket I now kept permanently folded on the armchair. This routine became the new architecture of my life. My weeks were structured around the nights he was there and the nights he was not. The nights he was there were filled with a quiet, agonizing tension, a mix of profound joy and suffocating restraint. The nights he was not there were just empty. I became a scholar of his sleeping form. I learned the specific way his brow would furrow when he was dreaming, the slight twitch of his fingers, the soft, almost inaudible sigh he would let out as he settled into a deeper sleep. As a photographer, I was trained to observe, to notice the minute details that reveal a larger truth. I was now applying that same intense scrutiny to him, cataloging every nuance of his unconscious state. The way a stray beam of moonlight from the window would catch the line of his jaw. The way the blanket would rise and fall with the steady rhythm of his breathing. I was capturing these images in my mind, storing them in my own private gallery. They were portraits of a devastating intimacy, an intimacy that only existed in the space between waking and sleeping, a territory he entered without a passport and of which he had no memory in the morning. Every morning after he stayed, the dynamic would reset. He would wake up on the couch, slightly disoriented, and a curtain of friendly distance would immediately fall between us. He would be all apologies and gratitude, thanking me for letting him crash, as if it were a one-time imposition rather than our new normal. He would drink the coffee I made him while standing in the kitchen, already mentally logging into his day, his mind clicking back into the world of logic and code. The vulnerability of the night would be gone, locked away. He would be Julian, my best friend, and I would be Leo, his. The ambiguity, the warmth, the closeness of the night before would evaporate in the morning light like a dream. And I would be left alone in my apartment, the indentation of his head still on the couch cushion, the lingering scent of his presence in the air, feeling like a ghost in my own life. This period was a masterclass in self-torture. I was living in a state of suspended animation, constantly analyzing every gesture, every word, for a sign that this meant more. When he would shift closer to me on the couch before falling asleep, was it an unconscious seeking of warmth or something else? When he would thank me in the morning, was the gratitude in his eyes just for my hospitality or for something deeper he couldn't name? I was building a case, gathering evidence for a verdict I was terrified to hear. My heart had become a courtroom where I was both prosecutor and defense, arguing endlessly over the interpretation of ambiguous evidence. The hope was a dangerous, addictive substance. Each night he chose my couch over his own empty apartment was another dose, feeding the fantasy that this wasn't just about his loneliness, but about our connection. The fear, however, was a cold, sobering counteragent, reminding me that I was likely just a convenience, a comfortable stopgap until he rebuilt his life. The ritual escalated, as rituals often do. One brutally cold night in January, he showed up shivering, having walked the 10 blocks from the subway station without a proper hat. He looked pale and utterly depleted. After our usual routine of tea and quiet television, as he was starting to drift off, he murmured, his voice thick with sleep, "It's so cold, Leo." It wasn't a complaint. It was a simple statement of fact. But I heard the unspoken plea beneath it. The couch was near the large, drafty window of my living room. My bed, in my small, well-insulated bedroom, was not. The thought appeared in my mind, fully formed and terrifying. Ask him to sleep in your bed. It was a line I had sworn to myself I would never cross. The couch was a neutral territory, a DMZ of plausible deniability. My bed was something else entirely. It was my most private space, and inviting him into it felt like a confession. I stood there for a full minute, paralyzed by indecision. He shivered again in his sleep, a small, involuntary tremor. And that broke the spell. My desire to offer him comfort finally overpowered my instinct for self-preservation. "Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, clouded with sleep. "Come on," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You can take my bed. It's warmer in there." "I'll take the couch." He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, I thought he would refuse. But then he just nodded, a slow, tired movement. He pushed himself up from the couch and followed me to the bedroom like a sleepwalker. I pulled back the covers, and he slid in, fully clothed, and was asleep again almost before his head hit the pillow. I retreated to the living room, my heart pounding, and lay down on the couch he had just vacated. It was still warm from his body. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling as though I had just swapped places with a ghost. This, too, became part of the ritual, but with a twist. The next time he stayed over, I offered him the bed again. He accepted, but then he said, "It's a big bed, Leo. It's stupid for you to sleep on the couch." My blood ran cold. It was a logical statement, a practical suggestion. My bed was a queen. There was more than enough room for two people who were just friends. It was an offer I couldn't logically refuse without revealing the illogical, emotional truth of my feelings. To say no would be to admit that sleeping next to him was not a neutral act for me. It would be an admission of guilt. So, with my throat tight, I agreed. "Okay," I said, the word feeling flimsy and inadequate. That night, I entered my own bedroom like a trespasser. I built a formidable wall of pillows down the center of the mattress, a clear and pathetic demarcation of territory. I lay down on my designated side, my back to him, my body rigid with tension. I could feel his presence behind me, a source of immense heat and energy. I did not sleep. I listened to him breathe, just feet away, in my own bed, and felt the chasm between friendship and love yawning wide beside me. The pillow wall became our new unspoken rule. It was the physical manifestation of our ambiguity. A ridiculous, tangible boundary in a relationship that was becoming increasingly boundaryless. Some nights, the wall was a fortress, a clear line neither of us crossed. On other nights, I would wake in the middle of the night to find it partially dismantled, a pillow having been pushed aside in sleep, his arm or his leg thrown across into my territory. In those moments, I would lie perfectly still, barely breathing, a thief stealing a moment of forbidden closeness. I would wait until my own frantic heartbeat subsided, and then, carefully, I would retreat to my side and rebuild the wall, my hands trembling. This was our life now, a nightly construction and deconstruction of boundaries, a silent negotiation of intimacy conducted while one of us was asleep. It was a beautiful, exquisite torture, and I was a willing participant. The thing about photography, the thing I love about it, is its honesty. A photograph captures a moment of light, a fraction of a second, and holds it still forever. It doesn't lie. It shows you what was there. My life with Julian had become the opposite of a photograph. It was a long, blurry exposure, full of motion and ambiguity. I felt like I was living in a ghost image, trying to make out the solid lines of what was real. I was so focused on interpreting his actions, on developing the meaning behind his unconscious gestures, that I had lost sight of my own truth. I was living a half-life, a creature of the shadows, existing only in the reflected light of his presence. My own art began to suffer. My photographs became muted, distant, as if I were shooting the world through a thick pane of glass. I was an observer in my own life, documenting a story whose ending I was too terrified to force. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday night in April, almost 6 months after the ritual had begun. The air was thick with the smell of wet pavement and blooming things. Julian was in a strange mood, quieter than usual, his energy coiled and tense. He had barely spoken since he'd arrived, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. We went through our nightly routine, but the silence between us felt different. It wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, charged with unspoken words. We ended up in my bed, the now familiar pillow wall erected between us. I lay on my side, my back to him, listening to the rain and the sound of my own anxious thoughts. For hours, neither of us moved. I assumed he was asleep. I was on the verge of finally drifting off myself when his voice cut through the darkness, soft and hesitant. "Leo." My eyes snapped open. My heart gave a painful lurch. He had never broken the silence before. Never. "Yeah," I managed to say, my own voice rough with disuse. There was a long pause, so long that I started to think I had imagined it. Then he spoke again, his voice even quieter than before, laced with a vulnerability I had never heard from him when he was awake. "Would it be okay?" he began, and then he stopped. I could hear him take a breath. "Would it be okay if there wasn't a wall tonight?" The world stopped. The sound of the rain, the hum of the city, my own breathing, it all faded away. There was only his question, hanging in the air between us. It was not a logical question. It was not a practical one. It was a question from the heart, and it demanded an answer from mine. The pillow wall was our last line of defense, our final piece of plausible deniability. To remove it was to admit that this was not about warmth or convenience or friendship. It was about something else, something terrifying and real. I felt a seismic shift inside me, the cracking of the dam I had so carefully constructed around my feelings for more than a decade. I could say no. I could pretend I didn't understand. I could protect myself, retreat to the safety of the known. Or I could take a step into the terrifying, beautiful unknown. I could choose honesty. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. Instead, I slowly, deliberately, reached back and pushed the top pillow off the bed. It landed on the floor with a soft thud. I pushed the second one after it. Then, I turned over to face him. In the faint gray light filtering through the window, I could just make out his silhouette, the dark shape of his head on the pillow. He was already facing me. We lay there for a moment, in the new, uncharted space between us, the air electric. He moved first. Slowly, he lifted a hand and gently, so gently, cupped my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, a gesture of such profound tenderness that it broke something open inside me. I could feel a tremor in his fingers, or maybe it was me who was trembling. He leaned in, his face coming into focus in the dim light. His eyes, wide and dark, were searching mine, asking a final, silent question. I gave him the answer by closing the last inch between us. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was a discovery. It was soft and hesitant and deeply uncertain. It tasted of rain and salt and the terrifying, exhilarating relief of a truth finally spoken after a decade of silence. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the moment a photograph, held in darkness for years, was finally submerged in the developer, the latent image blooming into startling, undeniable life. It was everything. And in that moment, the carefully constructed fortress I had built around my heart didn't just crumble. It turned to dust and blew away on the wind. The aftermath of a storm is a strange and silent thing. The world feels both broken and washed clean. That's what the morning felt like. We woke up tangled together, the ghost of the pillow wall a distant memory. The light filtering through the blinds was soft and forgiving. For a few beautiful, hazy moments, everything felt perfect. There was a quiet rightness to waking up with his arm draped over my waist, his face peaceful in sleep just inches from mine. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. But as the city outside began to wake up, so did the reality of what we had done. I felt Julian stir beside me, a slow tensing of his muscles. He pulled his arm away. He sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair, and he wouldn't look at me. The silence in the room was no longer intimate. It was brittle, fragile, like thin ice stretched over a deep, dark body of water. "I should go," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look at me. He just swung his legs out of bed and started gathering his clothes from the floor. The easy intimacy of the night had vanished, replaced by a frantic, panicked energy. I watched him, my heart sinking into a cold, dark pit in my stomach. I wanted to say something, to ask him to stay, to talk about what had happened. But the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming fear. What if, for him, it was a mistake? A moment of weakness born from loneliness and grief. I had risked everything for that kiss, and now I was terrified that I had lost it all. He dressed in a hurried silence, a man desperate to escape a crime scene. At the door to my bedroom, he finally paused and turned to me. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on the floor. "Leo, He started, then trailed off. He shook his head. "I'm sorry. I have to go," and then he was gone. I heard the front door click shut, and the sound echoed in the sudden, crushing emptiness of the apartment. I lay back down in the bed that still held his warmth and felt the first, sharp sting of tears. The next 3 days were a special kind of hell. It was a silence more profound and painful than any we had ever shared. My texts went unanswered. My calls went straight to voicemail. The digital tether that connected us had been severed. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would leap with a desperate, pathetic hope, only to crash back down when I saw it was just a spam email or a notification from a social media app. The apartment felt vast and empty, haunted by the ghost of his presence. The couch looked accusingly bare. The wool blanket felt like a funeral shroud. I replayed the kiss, the entire night, over and over in my head, scrutinizing every detail, every touch, every whispered word. I was a detective examining the evidence of a crime, but I didn't know if I was the victim or the perpetrator. Had I misread everything? Had I taken advantage of his vulnerability? The questions were a merciless chorus, a soundtrack to my anxiety. The hope that had been so bright and blinding just a few nights before had collapsed into a black hole of doubt. I barely ate. I couldn't sleep. I tried to lose myself in my work, to hide in the comforting darkness of my darkroom, but there was no escape. Every shadow reminded me of the darkness of my bedroom that night. Every emerging image in the chemical bath felt like a mockery of the one beautiful, real thing that had emerged between us, only to be snatched away. I was trapped in the aftermath, the landscape of my life shattered and unrecognizable. On the 4th day, I knew I couldn't live in this limbo any longer. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I needed to know the truth, even if it was the truth I feared the most. I needed to hear him say it was a mistake. I needed the finality of a closed door, because the silence and the space he had left behind were unbearable. I put on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and walked out of my apartment with a grim, desperate resolve. I was going to his place. I was going to force the confrontation that he was so clearly running from. The walk to his apartment building felt like a march to my own execution. With every step, a voice in my head screamed at me to turn back, to leave it alone, to protect what little was left of my heart. But another, quieter voice urged me forward. It was the voice that had chosen to take down the pillow wall. It was the voice that knew that a truth, no matter how painful, was better than a beautiful lie. His apartment was in a sleek, modern building that had always felt impersonal to me, a place of clean lines and empty spaces, so different from the lived-in clutter of my own home. I stood outside his door for a long time, my hand hovering over the buzzer. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I finally pressed the button, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway. I waited. For a moment, there was nothing, and a part of me hoped he wasn't home. But then I heard the sound of footsteps, and the door opened a crack. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same t-shirt and sweatpants he'd had on for days, His hair was unwashed, and there were dark circles under his eyes that I had never seen before. He looked haunted. He saw me, and his face, already pale, seemed to lose its remaining color. He didn't look angry or annoyed. He looked frightened, like a cornered animal. "Leo," he breathed, his voice a rough whisper. He made no move to open the door wider, to invite me in. He just stood there, a barrier between me and the rest of his life. "We need to talk, Julian," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You can't just disappear." Not after that. He flinched at the mention of that, as if the word itself had struck him. He looked down, away from me, and I could see the struggle on his face, the war between his instinct to flee and the part of him that knew he owed me an explanation. "Not here," he muttered finally. He opened the door just enough to slip out into the hallway, pulling it shut behind him. He wouldn't even let me into his space. The rejection was a physical blow. We stood in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, two strangers who had shared the most intimate parts of themselves just a few nights before. "What do you want me to say, Leo?" he asked, his voice low and strained. He was hugging his arms around himself, a defensive posture. "I want you to say the truth," I said, my own voice starting to shake with a mixture of anger and hurt. "I want you to tell me what that was. For you. Was it a mistake? Was I just a warm body because you were lonely? I deserve to know, don't I?" He winced, and finally, he looked at me. His eyes were filled with a desperate, painful confusion that mirrored my own. And in that moment, my anger evaporated, replaced by a wave of empathy. He wasn't a monster. He was just as lost as I was. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "God, no, it wasn't a mistake. That's what scares me." He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. "Leo, I don't know what's happening. My whole life, I've had a plan. A blueprint. College, job, girlfriend, marriage. It was all laid out, a logical progression. And it all made sense. And then Chloe and I, the whole structure just fell apart. I was in free fall. The only thing that felt solid, the only thing that made any sense, was you. Was being at your place. It was the only time my brain would shut up." He opened his eyes, and they were glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't plan for this. For you. For this feeling. It's not in the blueprint. It doesn't compute. And it terrifies me. Because it feels more real than anything else has in a very, very long time." He took a shaky breath, the confession tumbling out of him now, a torrent held back by a crumbling dam. "That night, when I asked you to take the wall down, I wasn't thinking. I was just feeling, for the first time in forever. And it felt right. Kissing you felt so right. And then I woke up the next morning, and my brain switched back on. The logic board fired up, and it just started screaming at me. This is not the plan. This is not who you are. What are you doing? You're going to destroy the best friendship you've ever had. You're going to hurt him because you're a confused, broken mess." So I ran. I ran because I was terrified of what I was feeling, and I was even more terrified of hurting you. He finally stopped, his chest heaving, his gaze locked on mine, waiting for my judgment. I looked at him, at this brilliant, logical man whose world had been turned upside down by a feeling he couldn't categorize or explain. I saw not malice, but fear, a profound, deep-seated fear of the unknown. And I realized that we had both been terrified, but for different reasons. I was afraid of losing him. He was afraid of finding himself. I closed the small distance between us, and, without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine instantly, a desperate grip. "You're an idiot," I said, my voice soft. A small, watery smile touched his lips. "I know, you think I haven't been terrified?" I continued. "Julian, I have been in love with you for more than 10 years. I have been living in a constant state of terror. Terror of you finding out, terror of destroying what we have. That night wasn't a mistake. It was the first honest moment we've had in a decade." His eyes widened, the full weight of my confession finally landing. 10 years, he whispered, his voice full of a dawning wonder. I just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He stared at me, his green eyes searching my face, recontextualizing a decade of friendship through this new lens. He was looking back at all the late nights, all the conversations, all the shared silences, and seeing them for what they were. The pieces were clicking into place for him. The code was finally compiling. "Oh," he said, a world of understanding in that one small word. "Oh, Leo, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," I said. "Just don't run away again. We can be scared together." He tightened his grip on my hand, and for the first time in days, I felt the ice around my heart begin to thaw. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay. Scared together. I can do that." In that sterile hallway, under the unforgiving fluorescent lights, we began to build a new blueprint. One without a plan, without a logical progression. A blueprint for us. The beginning of our new life was not a sudden, dramatic sunrise, but a slow, gentle dawn. It was a process of learning and unlearning, of dismantling old habits and tentatively building new ones. We started over, in a way, but with all the cards on the table. The ambiguity that had been our constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by a fragile but determined honesty. The first few days were a study in careful navigation. We were like two people learning a new language, fumbling with the grammar of a shared, spoken affection. A hand held across the table at a coffee shop felt like a monumental declaration. The first time he kissed me in the daylight, a chaste, sweet kiss in the middle of my kitchen, it felt more real and more revolutionary than the desperate, rain-soaked kiss in the dark. We talked. For hours. For days. We laid the last decade of our friendship out between us and examined it under this new, honest light. He told me about the persistent, low-grade loneliness he had felt even in the midst of his relationship with Chloe, a sense of being fundamentally misunderstood that he could never articulate. He confessed that his late-night visits to my apartment had started long before their breakup, born of a need to be in a space where he didn't have to perform, where he could just be quiet and be seen. I told him about the library, about the ache of watching him with his girlfriends, about the years spent carefully curating my words and actions to keep my heart hidden. It was a painful and beautiful excavation, digging through layers of unspoken feelings, of missed signals and guarded hearts. With every story, with every shared vulnerability, the foundation of our new relationship grew stronger. The rituals that had defined our period of ambiguity began to transform. The couch was no longer a place of agonizing tension, but one of easy comfort. We could sit side by side, my head on his shoulder or his legs across my lap, and there was no subtext to analyze, no hidden meaning to decipher. It was just closeness, simple and pure. My bed was no longer a territory to be divided by a wall of pillows. It became our shared space, a sanctuary. There was a profound peace in falling asleep next to him, knowing that when we woke up, he would still be there, and he would not be a stranger. The door to my apartment, which he had once entered as a refugee seeking shelter, was now the door he came home to. We were building a home together, not out of bricks and mortar, but out of shared mornings, quiet evenings, and the simple, radical act of choosing each other, day after day. He began to open up in ways I had never seen. The man who had once described his heartbreak in terms of algorithmic failure started to find the words for his feelings. He was still logical, still Julian, but he learned to apply that powerful intellect to his own inner world. He would describe his anxiety as a runaway process hogging all the CPU, or his happiness as a perfectly optimized system running without any errors. It was his language, his way of translating the chaos of his heart into a system he could understand, and I loved him for it. I, in turn, found my own art again. The glass pane between me and the world dissolved. My photographs became infused with a warmth and an intimacy that had been missing for years. I started a new project, a series of portraits of him. Not posed, formal portraits, but quiet moments captured in our shared life. Julian asleep in a patch of morning sun, his face a study in serenity. Julian focused intently on his laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. Julian laughing in my kitchen, his face thrown back in pure, uninhibited joy. I was no longer just an observer. I was a participant. My camera was not a shield, but a bridge. There are moments in your life that are not disguised at all. They arrive with the weight and clarity of a landmark, a mountain you have been climbing toward for years without even realizing it. They are not quiet tremors. They are the summit. Standing here, in this suit that feels both alien and perfectly right, looking at him across the small space that separates us, I can see the entire 15-year journey laid out behind us. I see the nervous boy in the lecture hall, the exhausted friend on my couch, the terrified man in the hallway. And I see the man standing before me now, his green eyes, the same ones that captivated me on that first day, filled with a calm, steady love that takes my breath away. Our friends and family are a soft focus blur in the background. The only thing that is sharp, the only thing that is real, is him. We are about to say the words, the vows, the promises. But we have been making them all along, in every unspoken gesture, in every shared silence, in every night we chose to face each other across an empty space instead of hiding behind a wall. This moment is not a beginning. It is an arrival. It is the beautiful, honest silence we have finally learned to create together, a quiet room in a loud world, a place where two unlikely people, a photographer and a programmer, finally found a home. It is the final, perfect development of an image that was there from the very first frame.